Hey there, Gators. We're back for the second part of Psych 230, Chapter 1. So in this part, we're going to talk about the research. So in the first video, we talked more about what is developmental psych as well as the theories. And research. So we're going to just talk about how we actually go about doing the study. So if you remember in the first video, we had a picture of a young adolescent who was engaging in substance use. So it looked like she was drinking alcohol, maybe smoking some cigarettes. And so developmental psychologists want to know maybe why is she doing that? So what's going on in her life that is having her, decide to engage in substance use? And then what kind of outcomes might we expect for her to experience down the road? And so we can do things like set up research studies. So there's a lot of different ways we can set up a research study, and we're going to go through some of the main ways that we would do that. So one of the ones that people will use, relatively easy, is just systematic observation. So it's observation because we're watching people, but it's systematic because we're doing it in an empirical, scientific way. So one way we can do this is naturalistic observation, and we just go watch people in real life. So one thing I did in college to help with research that a professor was doing at ODU was stand out on the street corner and watch people run red lights. And then I would record this with this little device that I held. And so it was just watching people live their lives. There can be issues with that though, and so you can probably think of several issues. People might not want you looking at them. You might get, you might see an accident and then have to be like a witness if you're watching people on the side of the road. But also just people might change their behavior if they know you're staring at them. So this is an effect that we know in psychology, where if you know that you're being watched, if you're making some kind of thing at your job and your boss is staring at you, you're going to do a better job because you want people to think that you're not slacking off. And so that's an issue if people know you're staring at them. So we need to be unobtrusive. We can also do things like structure and observation. So with this one, we're still in the real world, but we're instead kind of tweaking things just a little bit in the real world. So one famous example in psychology is a study where they went to phone booths, which we no longer really see, but they would put a quarter in the phone booth and just kind of have it hang in there. And that way the person who would go in would get a free call. And so this should boost their mood, like, hey, I just got a free call. And then they would kind of stage little things outside of the phone booth, like dropping a bunch of papers to see if the people who got a free phone call would be more likely to help others. So in this case, they're setting up a situation that didn't already exist in order to see what kind of behaviors people will engage in. Everything that we would choose to do in psychology for research, though, has some possible issues. There are no perfect ways to do research. People are messy. It's really hard to get a good snapshot of people. We're difficult to study. It's not the same thing as, an organic chemistry lab or something where you expect the same thing each time. It's just people are messy. So with this, you could set up a experiment, and then your dime or your quarter just falls out of the machine randomly. You could set something up and then your person walks by to drop papers, but a car gets in an accident right in front of them. Just so many different issues, or people don't even notice that they have a quarter there. So there's always issues that are possible. Another way that we can measure things is to set people with some tasks. So with this, we've got photos. You could bring people into a lab and have them rate what emotion the people are expressing in these photographs. So you'd be saying, I want to understand your behavior. I'm going to give you a task to do, and let's see how you perform. So this can be problematic because, your behavior in a task-like environment, sitting in a lab, doing a random task may not be the way that you would act in the real world. So maybe you have a hard time saying this person is feeling maybe angry or disgust, but if you see it out in the real world where you get people's emotions and their hands and their voice, you're good at saying, what emotions people are expressing. So it's a good thing. We can give somebody a task, see how they perform, but everything has its drawbacks. This one I'm sure that you've done many times is a self-report. So with this, you go to Taco Bell and they say, how was your burrito on a scale of 1 to 10? Did you get enough cheese, on a scale of 1 to 10? And so, we just fill this out. It's a self-report. There's a lot of issues with self-reports though, and I'm sure you can think of many. People can lie. They can just not pay attention and circle the middle answer all the way down. They can lie because they want to mess with you or they want to look good. The way we ask the question can make a difference. That's why psychologists often ask the same thing in different ways. And so people will complain about that when they do surveys. They're like, it said the same thing, but like 6 different ways. We do that to try to get around the issue and make sure that we're not just getting some kind of bias, in the answers. But, the way we ask things makes a difference. And it's, it's a good measurement, but nothing's perfect for sure. We can do physiological measures. So psychologists will do things like get blood spots, take hair samples. I'm participating in a study right now where they took some of my hair to look at stress levels. So they'll cut it off at the root, and then they're able to look at the hormone cortisol throughout the hair, all the way down the length of the shaft of the hair. So all kinds of interesting things. I'm sure you can think of some issues there with that, though. Some people may not be willing to give up their hair and spit and blood and urine and everything for research purposes. You also have to be careful with that stuff. If people are trusting you with their blood samples, you don't want to go put it in the genealogy.com or something if they have not said, yeah, please do that. You have to treat it respectfully, use consent so people know what they're agreeing to do, and then, treat their samples with care. So, some considerations in research. Those are our big ways that we do research. We'll talk about some considerations. You've probably talked about reliability and validity many times in science, but this is just as important with psychological science. You want to make sure that whatever you're measuring is reliable, it's consistent, you get approximately the same answer every time. If you're getting wildly different answers on something that should be similar across time, you're not using a good measurement. So we want to make sure that we're doing that. And then validity is measuring what it's supposed to measure. So, if you write this measure and you say this is going to measure depression, but then you give it and what you're actually measuring is someone's experience of pain that they're having, then you don't have a good measure. It's not measuring psychological state, it's measuring a pain state. So we have to make sure that our measures are good, reliable, valid. It's important because if our measures are not reliable and valid, then our science is truly junk. We're not reporting out on good actual content, we're just reporting noise, and we definitely don't want to do that. People make decisions, important decisions, based on the science that's published. So we make sure that it's good science, that it's valuable. We also want to get a really good sample. So ideally, we would love to be able to talk about a whole population of people. So if we want to understand stress in the United States, we want to be able to say, this is the stress levels in the U.S. But the problem is we don't typically have access to the entire United States. And so what we have to do instead is figure out who can we get access to and then have that as our sample. So maybe we get 25 people from 25 different cities across the U.S. and that's our sample. And we want to be able to say this sample is reflective of the population. So we have to be careful and mindful of the characteristics behind why we would choose that sample. Now we've got some designs. So we talked about the methods, the ways we might get this data, some of the important implications of the data, and then finally the ways that we would structure our data or our designs. One huge thing that you'll see all the time in psychological science is correlational studies. So this is a correlation between two variables. So if we look at your GPA and your SAT scores, we would expect them to be related to one another. But that does not mean that one causes the other. This is a really important thing in science and something that people confuse all the time. If you don't really do a true experimental design where you're manipulating one factor and measuring its effect on the other, then all we can say is that things are related. There's an association. We do not know for sure that one causes the other. So in this example, we have being smart could cause you to have more friends. Having more friends could cause you to be smart. Or really, it could be this third variable that explains the whole relation, like parents who are warm and supportive have children who are smart and children who have more friends. And so, we don't know for sure what the causal factor is in a correlational study. These examples give some really interesting information for that. This first one goes through a lot of ways that people have reported the news and how people mess this up in the news all the time. So they'll say something like, ice cream causes drownings, oh no, and you're like, oh my goodness, I shouldn't eat ice cream anymore, it's going to cause me to drown. But then if you actually look at it, the causal factor is that it's hot outside. So it's really hot outside, you're eating more ice cream, you're more likely to be in bodies of water and therefore more likely to drown. So ice cream isn't causing drowning, instead the summer months are causing people to consume ice cream and unfortunately to drown in higher numbers. So this will talk about, this link goes over some of the ways that news articles will mess that up. And this one, Tyler Vigen, this is totally just, for fun, but it talks about some spurious correlations. So one way that we are able to see that correlations do not equal causation is by looking at some of the real correlations in the world. So if we just take a couple random points of data and shove them in a correlation matrix, many times we're going to find that things are highly correlated that really shouldn't be. My favorite one on this link is Nick Cage's movies, and I think it's Death by Drowning. And so it's saying that they're highly correlated, but typically Nick Cage puts his movies out in the summer when it's hot. People are in bodies of water when it's summer, when it's hot. And so we're more likely to see those things be related. But it doesn't mean that one causes the other. So if we want to say one causes the other, we want to do things like experiments. So with this, we manipulate an independent variable, we measure then the dependent variable. So you probably did this with science labs in the 2nd grade, where you give one plant water and you give the other plant Kool-Aid, and then you measure, how well they grow. We can do this in human behavior studies. We give one kid 10, 30, or 90 minutes of exposure to violent television, and then we measure their violent or aggressive acts. Another way of studying that psychologists love to do, developmental psychologists in particular, are longitudinal studies. So with this, we observe one group over time. So I'd measure you at 25, 35, 45, 55, 65, and then 80 years old. These can take a long time. They're very expensive. It's a huge time commitment. If you think that maybe you go to grad school and you get a PhD and you're going to start your study at 30 years old, if you follow these people for years and years and years like that, you're going to be like 100 by the time the study's over. It's going to be having to pass on to your future researchers. But the data is amazing from these studies. So we're able to say, at 25, this person was, had this belief structure. So maybe they were this political orientation, and then we followed them all the way till 80, and now they're this political orientation, or, whatever it is. It's just amazing data, but hard to get. So instead, psychologists will often rely on easier designs or more quick designs, like cross-sectional ones. So with this, you get different ages of people, and you compare them all at a single point in time. So if I wanted to understand politics, I could go to the mall and ask a bunch of 15 to 24-year-olds, 25 to 34, and 35 to 44, and ask them about their politics. And I could do that one day at one point in time, just go to the mall, offer them a slice of pizza to talk to me about their politics, and then my study is done. So it's a lot easier. Another really interesting method that you don't see as often, but that has a lot of potential, is you go to the mall. So this is the same graphic as before. Go to the mall, you get those people, those different ages, you ask them about their politics, but then you follow up with them every 5 years for 20 years. Or it doesn't even have to be so long. You can have a longitudinal study that's like a year or 2 years. You could follow somebody up in a sequential design for a year, or even 6 months. So just some length of time where you're not just getting one snapshot. Of course, the longer we go and the more data we get, the more rich and amazing it is. But a really great longitudinal study could just be following somebody up, 3 or 4 times for 6 months and seeing how they do. We can get a ton of data out of something like that. So it doesn't have to be decades. It's just really cool when it is. And then, so we have tons and tons of data. There's so much data. We get all the data. We want to understand it. So the best way to do that then is to integrate those findings. And so if I do a study and this other lab in Wisconsin does a study and then another group in China does a study, we can take all of those studies and mesh them together statistically. So using kind of math and statistics there, and we can see if effects that we find replicate across different studies. So if in my study it shows that kids who watch violent TV don't experience any more violent behavior, in the Wisconsin study it says they do, in the Chinese study in China they say maybe, we can integrate those all together and try to see which one is kind of right or which findings are the most strong. And so if you see meta-analytic papers, that's really good. That's what we want to find, meta-analytic papers. That's research across many different studies. We really want to conduct our research in an ethical manner, so you want to minimize the risk to your participants. You don't want to be out there harming them for no reason. You want to tell people what you're going to do to them. Avoid deception. Don't lie to people. Sometimes you might have to have a little bit of deception, like if you're testing a new drug and you can't tell them for sure, like, hey, I'm giving you the acne medication, or hey, I'm giving you the sugar paste, and we're going to see which one works. But it's a small lie, and people know that there's the potential for a lie. You tell somebody you might get the sugar, you might get the med. But we don't just want to lie to people. We want to tell them what we're doing, and then we want to keep that data confidential. So if somebody gives you their psychological data, and lets you use that for their study, it's very important to keep that anonymous and confidential to the best of your ability. And then how we communicate these results then is by publishing them. So we put them out in journals. This is Developmental Psychology. It's a huge journal in our field. And we say, this is what we found. We did a structured observation. We had a sample that looked like this. We followed them up over time. And then we ran the study ethically. We published it here. And then the hopeful, where studies should go, where studies should go is a policy, hopefully, is that they'll be used and really actually help somebody. So people can use it for their own lives to make their decisions. We can use them as a society to make decisions. And so some ways that developmental psychologists have already improved things is by helping people realize, when should we drive? Do we need to test older adults to see if they can still drive well? Who should adopt children? So should we let different groups of people adopt kids? When should we start school times? That's one that I know there's so many factors involved, but it's difficult because developmental psychologists know that teenagers start school too early. At 7 o'clock, 6:30 o'clock, or 6:30 a.m., this is way too early for teens. Their biological clocks are changing, their circadian rhythms are shifting. It's too early. And so we keep saying that, but it really hasn't made those policy changes yet. Those are hard to make, and I do respect that. Teens need jobs after school. Yeah, whole tangent there. But the fact is, we hope that research can eventually improve people's lives and be integrated into policy. That finally finishes chapter 1. I know it's a very long chapter, and so we split it into 2. Most of our other ones are more specific into parts of the lifespan and less nebulous, like here's a whole bunch of theories and the whole way we do science, which is like, whoa. So big stuff there, but we're finished, and I look forward to talking with you all for chapter 2.